Hey Jim, how you doing? Have you had a good week?
It has been a reasonable week. You keep asking me this question, Ollie, and it reveals how monumentally boring my life is. But it has been a comfortable and contented week, yes.
Yeah, no, to be fair, I can relate. Every week at the moment just feels so similar. And now the coffee shops have closed. I was incredibly excited, I have to say. It was like Christmas morning when the coffee shops opened, and I rushed back to them, and now they're all closed again, I'm in mourning at the moment. It's a real tragedy. This week we are talking about a topic. Our title is The Rise of the Machines, and in the run-up to this episode I watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix, and I know you've heard about this program, Jim. It's absolutely crazy. And there's a real buzz around it at the moment. It's essentially a bunch of ex-Silicon Valley employees discussing the dangers of the systems they helped create, so things like Instagram, Facebook, Google, and so on. And they particularly focused on the way these systems are designed to manipulate and eat up our time, and how they constantly demand our attention. And what I found really striking was many of these guys didn't even let their kids on the technology they had created themselves. And they talked about the lack of kind of regulation in this area and the lack of moral thought behind the algorithms and systems they were building.
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic program. I'd encourage everybody to watch it.
Yeah, it's definitely powerful. And I was just thinking as well, it links so well with what we're going to be talking about today. Because for most of season 2, we've talked about the future. And in this episode, we're going to talk about how technology will shape our future. And that's why we've called it The Rise of the Machines, a kind of fairly scary sounding title. The big technologies that will change the way we live and work are things like artificial intelligence and bioengineering. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about AI, and then we're going to move on to talk about bioengineering. And then once we understand what might happen in the next 3 decades, we'll consider the theological challenges thrown up by technology. So let's start with AI. Jim, this is your specialist area, if you like. This is what your career has been in. How is this new technology going to affect our lives?
It's going to be as big as the Industrial Revolution. I mean, if you want to appreciate how big an impact AI will have in your life, think of it in the same category as the invention of electricity.
That's a pretty striking claim. So AI is so transformational because it's going to support a whole new era of automation and robotics. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, we're already familiar with self-driving cars, software-driven trading algorithms replacing city traders in London. I mean, there are going to be millions of job losses up ahead as driverless vehicles and drones replace van drivers and truck drivers and taxis. And most people who work in car manufacturing or in an Amazon warehouse or in a supermarket will be replaced by a robot. But that is actually pretty basic stuff. AI systems will handle speech recognition and language translation as well as humans, so call centers will soon be a thing of the past. But even highly skilled professions like surgery will eventually be dominated by AI-driven robots. Most of the work done by GPs, by general practitioners, will be taken over by systems that can use biometric data and blood test results to diagnose most conditions. Domestic robots will become commonplace, doing everything from folding laundry to lifting elderly people in and out of bed.
That sounds like a pretty bleak description. Apologies to all our listeners who've just found out that you may not have jobs in a few years' time. But it sounds from your description that AI's big impact comes because it drives automation and robotics. But there is also a deeper issue with AI, isn't there? And that's the question of, could we ever build a machine that thinks like a human being? Now, a lot of movies and TV series play around with that idea. The idea of a vast AI system that ends up controlling the world or something like that. And would you say that it's even possible that machines might end up being more intelligent than human beings? I guess I'm asking you to describe what we mean by artificial intelligence.
Okay, well, before I answer that, we need to think about the structure of a human being, particularly our mental life. The book of Genesis tells us that when God created human beings in his image, he linked intelligence and consciousness together in one being, because he himself is like that, a conscious, intelligent being. Now, God is spirit, so he links consciousness and intelligence together in a non-material being. The Bible also talks a lot about, angels and spiritual powers who are clearly intelligent while being immaterial. So neither consciousness nor intelligence necessarily depend on a material substrate like a brain. Genesis also describes a third element of the human mind. Human beings have a conscience. I'm going to have to pronounce my words really carefully here, Ollie, because conscience is not the same thing as being conscious. Okay, Genesis teaches us that we aren't merely intelligent, self-conscious beings. We are moral. We have an inbuilt sense of what is right and wrong, the thing we call a conscience. So, when you ask me if a machine could theoretically be more intelligent than a human being, what you're actually doing is isolating one aspect of our mental life from the others. Because in a human being, intelligence is inextricably linked with self-consciousness and with a moral conscience. Okay, so that was a very long caveat. Let's now address your question. Let's think about intelligence, and then we'll consider the other two elements afterwards. So a lot of buzzwords are flung carelessly around the IT industry these days. We talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. But the truth is, we still have no idea how human intelligence works. AI systems at the moment just throw an awful lot of data at an awful lot of computing power for the purposes of pattern recognition. Now, our minds do much more than recognize patterns. As human beings, we are very good at perceiving things and making sense of visual images. We're equally good at talking and listening using natural language. And the key thing about us is that we learn by building up what you might call an internal mental model of the real world around us. I mean, just watch an infant over its first few years of life. Watch it reach out and grab a yellow building block and then it puts it in its mouth. What the infant is actually doing, it's making sense of a three-dimensional world, and it learns how to interact with a 3D world full of persons and by learning how to speak and ask a million questions. And it builds up a mental model of reality inside its head. The second feature of human intelligence is that we can abstract from one situation and then apply our learning to a different one. That's why we process narrative so well, and why we can handle analogies. So something is like this, or that is like this. And maybe the deepest mystery of all is the thing we call creative in thinking. That moment when we jump out of a mental box and watch a whole lot of complexity fall away as we reframe the problem we're thinking about in a new model that seems to comes out of nowhere. Now, it's theoretically possible that decades of research into neuroscience and software models of the brain will produce a form of intelligence that is akin to human intelligence. But we are decades away from that. It might even require quantum computing. If it does come about, then of course the power of computing would make such an intelligence extremely formidable, because it could process all the data in the connected world much more quickly than a brain could do.
What about the other two elements of the human mind you mentioned? Would such a superintelligence be conscious? Would it be self-aware?
I really don't think so. There is an aboutness, an intentionality in the way conscious beings interact with the world. Computers aren't conscious of themselves at all. An AI system could be controlling a nuclear missile or a vending machine, and it wouldn't know the difference. A vending machine has no idea what it's like to be a vending machine, because at the moment computers aren't conscious. Now, some atheist philosophers think that consciousness somehow emerges from intelligence, but Christian philosophers disagree. The truth is that human consciousness is a mystery. Christian philosophers are increasingly confident in their arguments that the mind is not the same as the brain. There is a spiritual dimension to us, and the thing we call consciousness isn't simply an aspect of the human brain. I'm really grateful for outstanding philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and J.P. Moreland, who argue that the mind is not the same thing as the brain. And that is a truth all our listeners should hold on to, even those working in fields like neuropsychology and neuroscience. Never allow culture to reduce you to a wet biological machine.
The third feature of humanity you mentioned was a moral conscience. The question of morality raises major ethical issues for AI systems, doesn't it?
Yeah, just think about a driverless car. If it has an accident and has to make a choice between injuring or killing its passenger or a child on the road, which should it choose? Or could I pay for an upgrade package that ensures that the car always privileges my well-being over anyone else, even a busload of school kids? Now I think about the really complex ethics of autonomous warfare. Who encodes the ethics of bombing a wedding in Afghanistan so that 3 terrorist leaders are taken out? The problem with those examples raise is this: whose morality gets encoded? The chief executive of the defense company? The IT expert? Whose morality is it anyway? We are literally building machines with subjective morality built into them. One of the foremost AI researchers in the world today is a woman called Rosalind Picard. She happens to be a Christian. She works in MIT. And she says this: the greater the freedom of a machine, the more it needs moral standards. There is no doubt that AI systems in the future will need some sort of worldview built into them, a set of encoded moral rules. So the real irony is, it's in the future, it won't be Christian doctors and Christian teachers who are on the ethical front line. It will be Christian engineers who have to be salt and light, deciding the way algorithms should be designed.
In terms of the ethics of these things, Jim, one of the biggest worries about AI in the future is its use of surveillance. Now, I remember studying IT law, and this was a real big concern, and the question of how the law can kind of catch up with technology as it advances is obviously a really significant one. Even at the moment, it's mad how much Google, Facebook, Amazon, and the like know about us. You know, Google knows everything we've ever searched and deleted. Unless you switch off location tracking, Google will have kept a timeline of where you've been every hour of every day since 2008. If you wear a Fitbit, as I'm wearing now, then they literally have every step you take recorded. Your resting heart rate is known to them. It's absolutely mad. Google stores all of your YouTube history. They have data from your calendar, your contacts, your emails, your call history, the messages you send and receive, the files you download, the games you play, your photos, your videos, your music, your search history, your browsing history, even what radio stations you listen to. A request to Google for all the data they hold on you would generate a file of over 6 gigabytes, which is the equivalent to 3 million Word documents. Facebook also holds a vast amount of data on its users, and these social media firms have access to your webcam and your microphone at any time, unless you disable them. So I think hopefully people get the point. The amount of surveillance being done on us is extraordinary. It's almost unbelievable. Why? I guess one of the first questions is, why are they holding all this data on us?
There's a really important rule which every young adult should learn off by heart. If the service is free, then I am the product. Okay, that's what surveillance capitalism is all about. If the service is free, then I am the product. AI tracker programs are geared to harvest as much data as possible that you generate about yourself. All the stuff that you've mentioned, but also data that can be derived from it. Things like your lifestyle, your habits, what you buy, the jobs you do, your social activities, your personal opinions on politics and religion. They know if you're about to become a parent. They know if you're a conservative, if you're a progressive, if you're Jewish, Christian or Muslim, if you're feeling depressed or suicidal. And once they've analysed all your data, they then sell that information about you, to advertisers. Google has an advertisement profile for you based on your location, gender, age, hobbies, career, interests, your relationship status, your estimated weight, and your income. And they then track how you react to adverts. So every Google ad I've ever viewed or clicked on is stored and analysed by Google's AI system.
Yeah, it's absolutely massive, isn't it? It's crazy. And your point there, Jim, about if a service is free, then I am the product. Well, that shows the motivation ultimately is profit rather than human flourishing. So I think that in itself causes us to have real concerns and questions about how these algorithms are designed and what lies behind them. And it doesn't take much of a leap to see how this tracking technology could create an authoritarian high-tech future. The technology to create a surveillance society has already been invented, and the only thing standing in its way are the values we share as a society.
That's right. In fact, China is already well down the path of surveillance, mass surveillance. The Chinese government is introducing what it calls a social credit system, which sounds something straight out of George Orwell. In simple terms, there's this vast network of street cameras linked to an AI system that also harvests data from social media and mobile phones. And the AI system then monitors and evaluates the activities of each Chinese citizen to rank his or her level of trustworthiness, how good a citizen they are. And the trust score allocated by the AI system, well, it affects one's eligibility for a mortgage, one's chances of getting a job, the school placements of your children. China's Ministry of Public Security is supposed to be building the world's largest facial recognition database. And it's experimenting with all this stuff. All this expansive surveillance technology is being used now on the Uyghur people who are enduring continual harvesting of biometric data every time they pass through a checkpoint. It's reckoned that between 1 and 2 million Uyghurs have been placed in so-called re-education camps. And there is compelling evidence coming out that the AI system is deciding who gets arrested.
Yeah, that's really disturbing. I mean, just a question kind of off the back of that, Jim. Do you think already technology is being used in the West to influence its citizens?
I think the problem in the West is the rise of corporate power. I think that's the problem. It is actually the root problem with capitalism. So, I mean, in London, you will, with cameras, in London, you will be recognized over 300 times a day in using systems that are accessible to the security services. So all the technology is there. But I think the real problem in the West is the drive for profit among private companies. And in many ways, that is even just as dangerous, because as you quite rightly say, once you build algorithms for profit rather than to support human flourishing, I think behind that problem, you find the answers for why society has become so divided, why Twitter is such a war zone. Everything is being driven by algorithms that have not been designed with human flourishing in mind. So I think that's the problem in the West.
That's really helpful, and actually that hits on something that was touched on in the social dilemma. Actually, the polarization of society actually is facilitated by this technology. Yeah, that's really helpful, Jim. Just in case people aren't freaked out enough by what we've talked about so far in terms of artificial intelligence, we're going to now move on to talk about bioengineering. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, during lockdown, I became slightly obsessed with this whole subject, and I'm not an expert, but I have read quite a number of books on it. And applying the term engineering to the sort of messy, wet world of chemicals, it just might seem like an overreach. So probably the best place to start, I think, is to explain why it's now possible to talk about bioengineering, that the term actually makes sense. Self-replicating organic life forms are created using information sequences. I mean, we're very familiar with information being stored in our computers as a series of ones and zeros. But information within DNA is stored as a sequence of 4 chemical bases, referred to using the letters CGAT. But it is still pure information. So today it's possible to move from data storage mechanisms used in computers to the mechanisms used at the molecular level in DNA, and then back again. Now, I'm going to prove that point by telling you a story. It's an absolute true story. It amazed me. A company in Boston, they took the entire database of Wikipedia, okay, that's 40 gigabytes of data, and they stored it in DNA. So they, first of all, converted the ones and zeros in a normal data file into the CAGT sequences used by DNA. And then they downloaded the CGAT sequences to a machine called a DNA writer. And that builds up the DNA sequence one base at a time. And the end result is a little test tube of clear liquid. It just looks like water, but it's full of DNA that holds all of Wikipedia. And you can then take that little test tube into another machine called a DNA reader, and it will read out the contents back into your computer. So that story helps make the point that bioengineering is possible because life is governed by information sequences. The second preliminary point I want to make here is the whole process of bioengineering is becoming highly automated. I mean, most of us, when we think about these things, you tend to think of some lonely scientist in a laboratory working on DNA sequences, sitting in a lab with a pipette, dripping chemical reagents into a test tube. But to understand where bioengineering is heading, it's much better to think of what are called full automation wet labs. And in one of these facilities, you get these long lengths, meters and meters and meters of magnetic tracks, all carrying little trays full of chemical reagents and samples of DNA from one processing machine to another. And then these robot arms lift the trays in and out of the machines. And other robot arms control banks of syringes that inject reagents or extract samples from the hundreds of centrifuge tubes in the trays. And now these robots operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But the really clever thing is this: they're going to end up being controlled. The whole thing is going to end up being controlled by AI systems. An AI system that learns, that gets smarter as each design, test, analyze cycle completes. as each experimental cycle completes. So the scientists will increasingly design their vaccines or their new life forms sitting in front of a computer rather than piping reagents into a test tube. Now, to boil all that down, I remember once being astonished watching a video of one medical researcher. He sat in front of his computer and he said, "I design apps that kill cancer." So he was using the language of a software engineer. Bioengineering really is becoming a true engineering discipline. Now, there is a terrifying risk that goes along with that new capability. There was one guy in the US caused a real stir a couple of years ago. He recreated a virus called horsepox, which is a sort of distant cousin of smallpox, perhaps the deadliest virus in human history. And the really scary thing is that the genome for his horsepox virus was stored as a data file. It was stored as ones and zeros in his computer. So any competent hacker sitting in their bedroom could have downloaded that file, the file of the genomic data, and then a competent terrorist could have recreated the horsepox virus for some very bad reasons.
Yeah, that's disturbing. And bioengineering certainly opens up a whole load of amazing possibilities. It'll probably transform agriculture as well as another area to think about. Jim, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, probably examples are the best way here. There's a set of 13 genes in rice which help the plant tolerate environmental stresses, things like drought or salinity, too much salt. So scientists use gene editing technology to play around with those 13 genes until they got a combination that generated a 30% increase in yields in field trials. Now that's a huge result. An even better example comes from the invention of so-called golden rice. It's astonishing to think that up to 500,000 children in the world go blind each year because of a deficiency of vitamin A. And of those children, half of them will die within 12 months. So scientists created this genetically modified form of rice that contains beta-carotene, which the body can easily convert into vitamin A.
The issue of genetically modified food is going to become a massive issue when it comes to negotiating a free trade agreement with the United States. What is your personal view on the ethics of GM food?
Yeah, just about every vested interest is going to scream chlorinated chickens and GM food. The fact that we use chlorine to clean lettuces is completely ignored at the moment. But anyway, I mean, there is a great deal of hypocrisy around when it comes to GM modified foods. So in Europe, it's perfectly legal to irradiate a tomato plant with X-rays or something to produce all sorts of weird and wonderful mutations. And then if the tomato grower ends up with a sweeter tasting tomato, after he's done all that irradiation, then he's allowed to grow and sell his new tomato species. But someone who uses gene editing technology to produce a sweet tomato is not. So the ethics around GM food are really complicated, and we're going to have to think deeply about them. I personally see a huge difference between modifying plants and modifying the genes of an animal like a pig or a cow, because in the former case, you're producing mutations that could quite easily have come about in nature. I would also worry a lot about what are called transgenic modifications. There was a scare story running around a few years ago about editing fish genes into tomatoes. I seem to be obsessed with tomatoes today, by the way. But the scientists did try this. They took fish genes and they added them into tomatoes to protect them against freezing weather. The experiment didn't work, but the ethics behind that experiment seem to me to be unbiblical because God deliberately made life forms according to their kinds.
Yeah, that just sounds super weird. Can't imagine eating tomatoes with fish genes in them. Trying to picture that in my head.
Well, do you know why they did it? Because the flounder, the fish that has to swim in the Arctic, has a gene which helps it produce proteins, a protein that is effectively antifreeze. So they had this whiz-away, because so many tomatoes are ruined by frosts. So they had this idea if they took that gene and put it into the tomato. But it didn't work.
Yeah, I can see the logic behind it, but it just seems really kind of freaky.
Yeah, your mind would melt if you think about what some scientists might be doing behind closed doors.
Yeah, and exactly. And kind of connected to that is this idea of, stuff like transplanting genetically modified pigs' hearts into humans, or even editing the human genome itself. I mean, what kind of issues arise in that area?
Well, there's a huge ethical difference between the two examples you've given, between using a genetically edited animal organ as a transplant. There's a difference between that and editing the human genome itself. The possibility of introducing changes into the genome that could be passed on to future generations, I think, is the single most terrifying idea here. It will allow people to change what a human being is. I mean, designer babies are already on the verge of becoming a real possibility. Wealthy parents will soon be able to ask scientists to create an embryo from their bodies in a test tube and then alter the genes so that taller, more intelligent babies are possible. So for the first time in history, we could start to change what a human being actually is. We would have opened up the human genome without anyone knowing what will happen as a result.
Yeah, I think the implications for sport as well are massive there. I mean, imagine you have genetically modified athletes. That's going to create, some serious issues.
And also genetically modified soldiers.
Yeah. Oh, wow. There's definitely going to be movies based on that. Probably are already. Yeah, maybe our listeners know of some. Let us know. I really want to watch a movie about genetically modified soldiers. I guess Captain America kind of is, to be fair. Anyway, moving on. Just as we draw this conversation to a close now, Jim, I want to ask you about how we should think about these things theologically. So thinking about technology theologically, I suppose the first thing to ask is how we have got to a point in society where nightmare scenarios like this are actually even possible through technologies like AI and bioengineering. Why have these things not been shut down already?
Yeah. The reason we're doing this episode is because I'm convinced that technology will shape the life of your generation and the next one more than anything else, more than any other factor. And yet the weird thing is that there is no one single political figure driving the West in a particular direction. I mean, there's no man of sin who's issuing decrees that we should move towards the sort of dystopian nightmare we've been discussing. It all seems to be happening by accident. It's being done on the basis of anecdotal and sympathetic scenarios. It's not as if there seems to be a grand scheme. There is a verse in Ecclesiastes, our favourite book at the moment, Ollie, which says, "Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child." The prophet Isaiah has a similar thought when the Lord prophesies in chapter 3, "I will make boys their princes, and infants shall rule over them." The really scary insight here is that there are no grown-ups in the room anymore. Our societies are not being led by morally wise people. Now, we're being led by people who might be incredibly smart, they might have lots of intelligence, but who in terms of moral wisdom are mere children. So the West is like a car that's heading for a cliff, but no one is sitting in the driver's seat. To change my metaphor completely, to try and illustrate the power of these technologies, we are giving incredibly powerful technologies to children. It's like giving them to a morally infantile society. It's a bit like putting a machine gun in the hands of a child. It isn't enough to say that technology is neutral. In that sense, so is a machine gun. But giving such technological power to politicians who don't have the moral sense to see its danger is going to lead us into disaster.
Yeah, I see that. And I guess, so as I listen to you, I'm also aware that, as Christians, we don't want to be those who are kind of held up as standing in the way of change or technological advancement. So what is the right way for us to think about AI and bioengineering theologically?
Yeah, well, we certainly don't want to be Luddites. We need to be intelligent and thoughtful in our responses to these things. But let's think about this theologically. Artificial intelligence separates intelligence from human personhood. Okay, so that is very much in line with the Gnostic beliefs that lie behind the whole modernity project. So think about transgenderism for a moment. If transgenderism tries to separate personhood from biology, artificial intelligence separates intelligence from consciousness and conscience. So we're slowly taking the holistic creation of human personhood and dividing it up into machine parts. Bioengineering will continue to dismantle the essence of human personhood by playing around with the most basic element of our physical makeup, DNA itself. Now, when you put all that together, you see that technology is being used to reduce humanity to the level of a machine. So here's my thesis, if you like to use that rather grandiose term. In theological terms, I think God is handing the West over to experience the consequences of its own choice. For 350 years, our society has been desperate to reduce a human being to a wet machine. That's what neo-Darwinism is all about. So in effect, I think God is saying, you want to be a machine? Very well, I will let you be a machine. I'll even let you reprogram yourselves. But the irony is, in the end, you will end up creating a different machine that will rule over you. Artificial intelligence will become your God. Needless to say, C.S. Lewis predicted the whole scheme in his book called The Abolition of Man. In trying to abolish God, the West will only have succeeded in abolishing man. We will have reduced ourselves to a set of algorithms running on a wet machine.
People like Elon Musk have already said publicly that AI could rule over us. But their answer is to merge with artificial intelligence. Elon Musk recently announced that his firm Neuralink had successfully implanted a chip into a pig's brain. And at the moment, the technology is relatively unsophisticated, but it points to a future where humans and machines begin to merge.
Yes, this is the future known as transhumanism, where the human brain is linked at the level of neurons to artificial intelligence. Lord Rees, he's an eminent scientist. He used to actually be the Astronomer Royal, and he once said this: "We can have zero confidence that the dominant intelligences a few centuries hence will have any emotional resonances with us, even though they may have an algorithmic understanding of the way we used to behave." That is chilling. Some transhumanists even predict that eventually human beings will be able to decouple themselves from their biological substrate and achieve immortality as a consciousness that exists within an AI system. Now, how Gnostic is that vision? There's an author called Yuval Harari. He wrote a book called Homo Deus, which literally means God-man. And he said, humans don't die because God decreed it, or because mortality is an essential part of some great cosmic plan. Humans always die due to some technical glitch. Every technical problem has a technical solution. We don't need to wait for the second coming in order to overcome death. So this is our penultimate episode in this season, Ollie, unless we do a Q&A. And in the final episode, we're going to consider how Christians can face a future like this with quiet confidence. But let me just anticipate that finale by saying this. The technology discussion we've just had highlights the real battle for your generation. It is to hold on to Christian anthropology, to stand for the extraordinarily high view of humanity described in the Bible. You aren't a reprogrammable bit of software running on a biological substrate. You are a unified person, body, soul, and spirit. Your mind is not identical to your brain. Your intelligence is inextricably linked with your consciousness and your moral conscience. You aren't a wet machine. You are a magnificent, physical, rational, moral, spiritual creature, a unified, eternal person made in the image of God. But you have been called to live in a culture that so hates the idea of God that it is prepared to destroy itself, to reduce itself to the level of a machine. Over your lifetime, you will get to watch humanity experience the bitter consequences of that decision.
Those are sobering and challenging words, Jim. You've left us all with plenty to ponder. As you mentioned, this is our penultimate episode of this season, Jim, but the plan is to have a Q&A right at the end of this season, so we'd love you guys to be getting your questions into us, and in that Q&A we anticipate doing it live. We'd love to have a back and forth dialogue with you about some of the topics we've covered this season. So thank you for listening, and we'll see you again in episode 8.